Welcome back, folks, to episode 116 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Skills Project podcast with me, your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, licensed professional counselor, and an adjunct professor at a local community college. And what we're going to be discussing today has to do with freedom, or the illusion of freedom more correctly, and how we tend to be told that we're born free and that we are free, but in fact we are bound by many social constructs and expectations that we call rearing and raising whenever we're growing up at the knees and feet of our family members, this sort of thing, or those that would raise us. But we become conditioned, we become trained to respond in a way that is going to encourage survival, so to speak. If we were learning from a tribe out in a very paleo way of living, we would have to learn not only what nature provides, but also where we can seek our provision as far as food, this sort of thing, safety, security, but also those things that are dangerous and that could eliminate or even harm us. And those are very astute lessons that we have to become very, very aware of, and therefore conditioned to recognize and respond. So it's a learning thing. And there are two aspects that we're going to point at. One is going to be environmental learning and how it relates to external locus of control, and also internal environment and how that relates to internal locus of control. But not necessarily playing with the jargon, but understanding that there's a relative strength in either one, but there's a potential weakness in either one as well. And as we move forward, we're going to start looking at how the illusion of freedom is given to us and how we, by living mindfully and thinking moment to moment, we can break free and shatter that illusion, and how it comes to us as a lesson on how to become not only better, but more self-regulated so that we can become better at navigating our environment, both internal and external, without necessarily becoming a victim to it. To kick off the discussion, what I'm going to do is look at what some of the early behaviorists and social learning theorists would talk about, and that had to do with our environment and how we interact within it, but also what we know as conditioning. Conditioning is a really heavy-handed term now, and it sounds and smacks of manipulation and control. And in some contexts, yes, that is correct. But also, whenever we think about sport and those things that we like to do, like maybe learn how to play music and gaining skill, conditioning takes on a new meaning because it has a more positive idea that is tied to that, such that we have an outcome that is favorable and desirable. Now, whenever we think about being conditioned by somebody that wants us to behave in a certain way, let's say family, for instance, this is something that most of us, whenever we are young, we are being taught by somebody, that be our parental or adult model, that would show us how to do things, how not to do things, what to avoid, and encourage certain things. And there was a lot of reinforcement of behavior that would be considered not only socially appropriate within the context of family or, let's say, village or city or town where you may live, or locale. We'll call those colloquial differences that we, in comparison, see from one place to the next that vary a little bit. But yet there is a certain thing that we would call, for instance, common courtesy, or common courtesies that may vary a little bit, but generally are considered the expectations of behavior, that we start seeing differences in hierarchy, who respects whom, and how help is given around the home, for instance, and who gets what chores, and also who gets the most deference and respect, such as our elderly, if we live in a more communal familial setting. We may have even generations of family living within the same home, and we take care of the elderly and the littles, and the ones that are in the middle, those that are of age to be able to provide support. This sort of thing will do so relative to the roles that each one of those people play, the babies and the elderly, and also those that are mature and that are carrying the largest load of keeping that system going. But we get conditioned or practiced by modeling, and this is something that Albert Bandura talked about, and he actually coined the term vicarious learning, having to do with how we visually see in our environment and how we can mock and copy the model of that behavior, whether it be good, bad, indifferent, doesn't matter. But the point is, we understand that by watching and learning, we can gain skill without having somebody formally teaching us step 1, step 2, step 3, do this, do that. And that is more like coaching. And this is part of the conditioning that is more positive, and that is life bringing, it's life giving, and it's also life affirming whenever someone is doing things that please another. So we learn how to socially connect, not only good feelings, pats on the head, good boy, good girl, and this sort of thing, with certain behaviors that are considered not only comforting to those that are around us because we're becoming more and looking more like them, but also we get a reward or payback because there's a measure of validation and acceptance that occurs there. And it's not always spoken in the words that I spoke them, but rather more so in the sense of the feeling one gets by getting smiles and affirming nods and this sort of thing that go along with doing something well and being accepted and doing something acceptable. So here's where one of the questions comes up, and where does self-regulation come into this relative to learning a new skill? Because by choosing to go along, so to speak, or learn said skill, or do said behavior as expected, we are choosing a measure of acceptance, and we're also choosing to not be shunned or not accepted so that we can get whatever it is that we need to survive, whether it be food, shelter, care, and nurture, this sort of thing. And also, we're making a decision away from things that would otherwise put me in a position of being outside of the norm, so to speak. And I put that in heavy quotes. And whenever we're looking at the idea of conditioning, it's not anything new. It's not something that psychologists came up with or that we just recently developed. It's something that's been around for a long time. And by observation of nature, we came to conclusions millennia ago. If we get into the readings of Zen meditation or Chan meditation, or even Patanjali's classic on yoga, the Eightfold Path, there is a large measure of understanding that there are certain behaviors that we do that are socially acceptable and that are useful to living amongst other people. So there was definitely something that was written down many years ago that guided what it was that would be our social behavior, our group behavior, versus our individual behavior. And also we have to recognize that not everything that we do is strictly for ourselves. And it is a very unselfish thing to be able to do things that placate others, because sometimes that lessens their stress, so to speak. But on the opposite end of that, we have the more selfish perspective, as one would call it. Not necessarily taking from another and leaving somebody with less, which is theft, by the way, in concept, but understanding that sometimes we have to do things that are in our own best interest, and self-regulatory skills may require that we go along to do what we need to do to get the things that we need, whether it be safety, nurturing, this sort of thing. Not a big surprise there. But whenever I've spoken in the past in this podcast about the social line that we live on and where we all get along to get along, and also whenever we're putting on the mask of civility or the mask of the polis, mask of the marketplace, that we are acting within a certain realm or range. But yet, whenever we may note somebody, let's say, we'll give this some context, that somebody was acting terribly at home, and maybe they're particularly belligerent and ugly and really don't recognize people's boundaries and maybe are a real cuss, so to speak, as they say in Texas. And why is it that I'm using this as an idea? But the idea is this, to give us some contrast, is that whenever we look at the same person out and about within the social realm, doing what one must do to get along, to get along, it seems fake. It seems like a lie. It seems as if we see the monster within, and they're putting on the mask, and we're just waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the mask to fall away, and for everyone to see the truth. the emperor's new clothes is the idea. And you realize that the emperor has no clothes. And that's the ugly part that's hidden, but people are getting along to get along, so they're acting as if that's not true. He's fully clothed, so to speak. So often we feel a sense of angst, discomfort, and upset because things do not seem like they're on the up and up. They don't seem honest, seems inauthentic. And this is largely true, but we're allowed to do the get along because that is how we trade and encourage our own survivability in the bigger sense. But the reality, this is where we break that illusion of freedom, is realizing that there's more to it. And there is always more under the surface. Just like whenever you have a cute baby, beautiful, smells like powder and baby lotion, and you know that once they drop a poo, that's it. They don't smell as good. That's the reality, and that requires that we take care of the human condition. That requires some cleaning up and maybe a clothespin to pinch your nose off because it's a little stinky. And what's Junior been eating, right? And I say this comically, but fact of the matter is that much of what we deal with in a day-to-day basis is not a straight line of complete freedom. It's not a straight line of complete conditioning and lack of choice in our life. It's not like that. It's intertwined. It seems to me it's like two dual sine waves living together, so to speak, and also kind of living in harmony in the sense that we know when to balance and when not. Whenever life gets difficult and we get stuck in that sense that we feel like that part that is not only manipulative but controlling of us, that we feel less freedom, it's more so speaking to the fact that we may feel a sense of deprivation. We may feel like we don't have enough payoff, enough joy, enough love, enough touch, enough kindness, enough closeness, enough money, whatever it is that we're looking at, and we feel like we're lacking, and we see the lack, and we notice a disparity. But how do we notice that disparity? By comparative looking at other people and seeing what they have, and then we start questioning, why don't I have that? Why can't I have that? Why won't I have that is probably the more correct question versus the I can't. I can't indicates capacity and ability and being beyond our reach, whereas I won't indicates that we have a choice and we can choose to do things that will get us those things, so to speak, if it becomes a material acquisition idea. But at the same time, in principle, it applies to behavioral care and nurturing. And how can I get more care and nurturing? Sometimes by not focusing on self so much and being able to provide care and nurturing, modeling what it is maybe that we want to get. And if the world is our mirror in concept, won't it reflect back what we give and how we are? That's, of course, a rhetorical question that we must ask ourselves, because sometimes, yes, sometimes it is that, but it all depends. One of the things that I used to mention to my former college students years back was that whenever we would touch on the physiology within a response and certain behaviors and beliefs that are developed as a result of a stressful or anxious or even a painful state, then they would wonder, well, if you have pain, then you have these kind of negative beliefs as the outcome, correct? And I would tell them, well, not necessarily. It depends. And it was the most frustrating thing to one of my students. I kind of laughed with her, and we made a joke about it because she started responding, well, it depends. And I said, yes, you got the idea that there is rarely ever an absolute when it comes to human behavior. And there's rarely ever an absolute when it comes to the outcomes of human behavior relative to states of stress and physiological duress that occur within a life. So it was a brilliant understanding, and it was a breaking through of the illusion of what it is that controlled comfiness of knowing. And fact of the matter is we're very limited in what we do know, and it's really impacted by these two things. We discussed what the points were going to be that we would move through, and that's going to be external environment, internal environment, and how it relates to external and internal locus of control. And these are some ideas to think about. So whenever we think about the impact of an external environment, we're looking at what's happening outside of us, what we see, people that are there, maybe people that we serve and help and love and interact in family with, this sort of thing. And then we have the internal environment, those things that result as we impact our external world, so to speak, how we interact with it, and what my decisions and judgments and beliefs and hopes and things that come up as a result of that. So really important stuff. So why is it that the internal and external locus of control in this discussion are tied to that? Sometimes we have to recognize that when we overly focus on what's happening outside of our body, in our life, we sometimes, to our detriment, don't take care of ourselves. We nurture ourselves. We pay attention to ourselves, if I can use that term. We're not attentive to what we need, our personal needs, to the detriment of our best health and wellness, because we're focusing on everyone else. Nothing wrong with being in service. As an example of somebody that had a very deep internal locus of control that was known to have done great things in helping people was Mother Teresa, but in her writings and journals to her higher ups within the church that she was serving under, she would write that distance and fear of emptiness, and also how she felt like she didn't feel God sometimes. And being a spiritual person, you would think that would be very, very unlike or uncharacteristic of somebody that was, within a very short time of her death, deemed a saint because of her continuous compassion. But yet in her writings, she always went out every day, and in spite of that fact, wherever she was even questioning whether or not there was a God in her life, because she couldn't feel it sometimes. Many times there was some depressive quality that went on. She chose to focus on other people. Now, those are extremes of focus internal, extremes of focus external, but because of what was going on internally, her internal locus of control, she was able to control what was going inside, and drive to control more what was going on outside as a result of where she felt that the actual battle was, more so than what was going on outside. If we look at what external locus of control provides, is that we tend to pay attention to the outside, and those things shape what goes on inside. She shaped what went on outside because of her inside. She didn't know what was going on, but she had a great deal of faith throughout, knowing that there was something there, even though she couldn't experience it in the sense that was palpable or measurable. But yet her faith and her hope drove her to shape what happened in the external environment that she lived in, and that was providing compassionate care in India. And it's a very hard example because she lived that for many, many decades, and it's definitely of note. So what does this have to do with me and self-regulatory skill? She was a great example of self-regulation and not quitting and not stopping as a result of how she was feeling, believing. But yet she had faith and hope that there was more, that there was something else. And that's what's important in this example. So if I have an internal locus of control, according to the studies, I tend to be happier because I feel like I have more choice. I don't feel like I don't have control. Whenever we see happiness in the workplace, people that are less depressed, less apt to get anxious and angry, it's the people that know that they have a greater degree of freedom and choice and control in what it is that is going to be their environment at work, and actually play a meaningful role in the outcomes. Whereas if we're looking at job satisfaction, where there's very little autonomy, very little input other than just go and do your job and get paid, the depression rates and the anxiety and anger rates are much higher. And the studies show this rather clearly. But it's something that we've known, that within our cultures, within our life experiences, we hear about where people get disgruntled and get upset and leave work settings, where people enjoy doing the work that they're doing, and knowing that the work they're doing is very helpful, and they continue at it for decades because there's a sense of peace that they get, a sense of joy and payback beyond the paycheck itself. So those are some important things to consider. The next couple of ideas I really want to drop come from operant conditioning. That is something that B.F. Skinner used to talk about, and he was definitely into conditioning, but it's not so much that I believe conditioning is most important. It's just sometimes being aware of the fact that when we're teaching and learning, we are conditioning, and whenever we're learning to gain a skill, we're conditioning as much as we are as the teacher. So it's just something that occurs, and the term once again sounds a little harsh and ham-handed, but in fact it points out a very distinct idea that's helpful in that we're gaining practice, we're gaining repetition in a behavior, whether it be for something more fun, more sportive, as they say in Spanish, deportivos, being able to do things in a repetitive manner that provides us an outcome that is gaining skill that I can maybe use on a soccer field or on gymnastic routine or in the martial art, the things that I do. Wherever we learn things, you don't just practice them once and expect the technique to stay. And what we understand is that that's neurological conditioning. We're training our body and our nervous system to respond a certain way. And these are important things to notice, not just merely in your head, in your mind, but also in your body and how we embody that sense. And we're training things more deeply. So these are the terms I want us to think about. Whenever we're reinforcing in a social sense, usually positive reinforcement is something that we encourage a behavior to continue by specifically pointing out, and this is going to be a very specific term, a specific reinforcement. If somebody throws out the trash and Johnny just threw the trash, we'll say he did that and he's 8 years old, and we'll say, hey, Johnny, I saw that you threw the trash out. That was great. Good job. Pat on the back. And here you go. I'm going to give you $1 because I expect you to do this. And when you do this each time, I will give you $1 to add to your savings. So that would be a very specific reinforcement example. The second is going to be a global reinforcement. This is going to be where somebody does a specific job. Let's say Johnny threw the trash again. And this time he's like, good job. But we don't identify him. We just identify the fact that the job was done, but didn't say he did it, nor did we point at it or give him an extra kudos and maybe an extra $1 for doing the job. But more global is one that does not specify him and what he did attached to the behavior, but still it's a reinforcement, more global, but it's also a little less effective for Johnny in the sense that it'll probably take more of that kind of reinforcement than it would a more specific reinforcement to encourage that behavior. The next is going to be a specific criticism. Johnny throws the trash, but the trash bag broke and, it leaked a little bit and there is a mess on the floor. So specifically, Johnny, next time you throw the trash, can you make sure that the bag doesn't tear because it spilled all over the floor? And that's it. There's no positive reinforcement going on there, but there's a specific criticism of how this was done, but it wasn't done to standard. And that can have a very deep impact in that he might not get the $1 for having thrown the trash because there's a mess on the floor as a result of shoddy trash throwing methodology, so to speak. And that, once again, is specific criticism. Now, a global criticism can be very powerful, as can the specific criticism. And the global criticism would be whenever he comes back from throwing the trash and the trash bag having leaked a little bit, we could say that there's so much trash out in these dumps and these landfills, and they're not being managed well. And this is just a terrible thing for general health globally. And to say something like that as a criticism related to a behavior where there was a little mishap, torn trash bag, that can lend a big weight and concern to little Johnny, making him feel not only bad about himself, but also bad about trash generally. And that more than likely will not encourage good trash throwing behavior per se, but it certainly will leave an impact of guilt and shame. So what does this have to do with self-regulation? Well, it has a lot to do with it, because much of what we learn whenever we're learning is conditioned, practice, and reinforce, whether it be specifically or globally. The payoff that we have internally, our internal environment, as impacted by our external environment, whatever reinforcement may have occurred there, or outcome skill gained, will determine whether or not I continue to go back or gain skill or improve that, or if I don't do that at all. So even whenever we're learning to do physical skills for fun or protection or life enhancement by learning how to gather food, this sort of thing, or hunt, all of those have these running concepts that we think about these things with to learn how to improve them. But there's an understanding that is a principle before we ever labeled it that has to do with not only reinforcing life enhancement and life reinforcement, so to speak, but also affirming life by doing these things. But there's a strength in repetition. There's a strength in conditioning, and it's not all bad, but we have to understand where it is. So where's the freedom in control, self-control, more correctly, self-regulation better. Where's the freedom that rises from that? In that we can actually navigate whatever stressors or irritations our external environment provides us. It also keeps us from becoming hyper-reactive to the internal environment and how we react to that external environment. And these are the things that whenever we have a sense of self-regulatory control and skill within those internal, external environment, mind you, this is where we find that space of freedom where I can choose to engage, or I can choose not to engage, or to improve by choice, and know where the impact is by knowing where the influences are, external and internal environment. My locus of control becomes much more internal, but it also becomes much more of a choice whether or not I do or don't do versus one wherever I have options imposed on me and I feel like I have no control or choice in the matter. So this is going to end our discussion today, and it did get rather deep, but also it's something that we have to point out because it's something that if we want to be skillful at what it is that we call our lives, regardless of what you do, we have to become aware of the influences and the dynamics that influence what it is that I choose, why I choose, and it's not always just how I believe. Sometimes it's the impact of the environment and what's going on at any one moment. And that kind of precedes much of what we believe as a moral, ethical value. And it's more driven by the payoff. What do I get out of this? Do I feel good out of this action or not? And what are the results of these actions? And I start future pacing. And all of this that we talked about today has to do with things that happen within a fraction of a moment before we even start really planning. So it's a very powerful tool to understand these ideas, these concepts, and understanding how fast it happens before we really start doing what we call our choice and our personally filtered through me, through my ego behaviors. Then I understand that much of these ideas are shaping what we do day to day. So for now, that's it for the discussion. I want to tell you thank you for sharing this Sunday afternoon with me. I appreciate your time and I appreciate your listenership. Share this podcast with people that you think will benefit. And even if there are people out there that you don't think will benefit, give it to them too. I would greatly appreciate it. Go to YouTube if you want to hear the podcast there, and like, subscribe, and share. I'd like to see that channel grow, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Walk well.